Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers. And those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession. And in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before, because their incomes have fallen. And so the collective attempt to increase savings fails. Defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behavior that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced. And this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security. And this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution. And this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments. And these investments create jobs and income. And so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behavior can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The paradox of the court when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case. And according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case. And so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment, and this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable, not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness. Its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters. And despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century. The method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. And this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma. On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative. And the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography. more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought. And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved. Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy, forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, well, it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction. But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority rule can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance. Respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will. And these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level, and democratic procedures at another. And procedures operate within the framework set by principles. And this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival, and different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance. A challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy. And the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of non-being, how nothing cannot be talked about. A philosopher attempts to state a simple truth, attempts to say that something does not exist, attempts to assert that unicorns are not real, that they have no being, that they are nothing, and yet stating this seems impossible, seems paradoxical, because to say that unicorns do not exist is to say something about unicorns, is to refer to them, to make them the subject of a statement. And how can you refer to what does not exist? How can you make something the subject of a statement if that something is nothing, if it has no being? And if you can refer to unicorns, then they must be something, must have some kind of being. But then the statement unicorns do not exist is false, is contradictory, because it refers to things that it claims do not exist. And this is the paradox of non-being, first articulated by Plato in the Sophist, the puzzle about how negative existential statements are possible, how we can truly say that something does not exist without contradicting ourselves, without presupposing the existence of what we are denying exists. And this paradox has troubled metaphysics throughout history, has generated multiple solutions, and remains a test case for theories of reference and existence. Imagine trying to deny the existence of something, trying to say that Zeus does not exist, that there is no such God, and the statement seems straightforward, seems obviously true, but analysing the statement reveals problems because the statement is about Zeus, makes Zeus the subject, and subjects of statements must be something, must have reference, must be objects that the statement is about. And if Zeus is the subject, then Zeus must exist in some sense, must be something rather than nothing. But the statement says Zeus does not exist, says Zeus is nothing, and so the statement seems self-refuting, seems to both presuppose and deny the existence of its subject. And this is the paradox, that negative existentials, statements denying existence, seem impossible to state without contradiction. Parmenides made this paradox central to his philosophy, argued that non-being cannot be spoken of or thought about, because speaking and thinking require objects, require that there be something that is spoken of or thought about. And non-being is not something, is nothing. And so non-being is inexpressible, unthinkable. And from this Parmenides concluded that non-being does not exist, that everything that is exists, that reality is one unchanging being, and change is impossible because change would require something to come into being from non-being or to pass into non-being, and both are impossible. And this radical conclusion follows from taking the paradox of non-being seriously, from accepting that we cannot coherently speak of what does not exist. Visualize the paradox as a linguistic trap. When you say X does not exist, you seem to refer to X, and reference requires that X be something, and if X is something, then X exists. And so the statement is self-refuting, and yet negative existentials seem to be true, seem to be among the most basic truths. And we need to explain how they can be true without contradiction, how we can deny existence without presupposing it. And this requires a theory of reference that allows reference to non-existence, or that reinterprets negative existentials so they do not really refer to their apparent subjects. One solution proposed by Russell denies that names like Zeus refer to objects, analyzes them as disguised descriptions, and Zeus does not exist becomes, there is no unique object that has all the properties attributed to Zeus in mythology. And this existential statement does not refer to Zeus, does not presuppose any object, but simply denies that the description is satisfied. And this allows negative existentials to be true, without paradox, without reference to non-existence. And Russell's theory of descriptions has been widely adopted as solving the paradox, as showing that negative existentials do not actually have the logical form they appear to have, do not refer to their apparent subjects. Another solution from free logic distinguishes between existence and reference, allows that terms can refer without presupposing existence, and negative existentials are statements that deny existence while preserving reference, and this requires revising classical logic, requires allowing that some terms refer to nothing, are empty names, and statements containing empty names can still be meaningful, can still have truth values. And Zeus does not exist is true because Zeus is an empty name, refers to nothing, and the statement denies existence without presupposing it. And free logic has been developed extensively, provides formal semantics for empty names, and handles the paradox by liberalizing logic to allow reference without existence. A third solution, from Meinongian approaches, accepts that non-existent objects are real in a broad sense, have being even if they lack existence, and Zeus does not exist is true, because Zeus is a non-existent object, has being but lacks existence, and statements about Zeus refer to this non-existent object, and the paradox is dissolved because reference does not require existence, only requires being, and non-existent objects have being, have properties, can be subjects of true statements, and this solution preserves the intuition that negative existentials refer to their subjects, while denying that reference requires existence. The paradox also appears in discussions of nothingness, of absolute non-being, because to say that absolute nothing is impossible seems to require referring to absolute nothing, making it the subject of a statement, and if it is the subject, then it must be something. And so the statement that nothing is impossible presupposes that nothing is something. And this generates contradiction, and Heidegger made this paradox central to his philosophy, explored the nature of nothingness, argued that nothing is not a thing, but is the horizon of being, the possibility of non-being that makes being intelligible, And discussing nothing requires special language, requires recognizing that nothing is not an object, but is something more fundamental. And the paradox shows limits of ordinary language, shows that metaphysics pushes language beyond its designed capacities. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, accept that there are true contradictions, dialetheas, statements that are both true and false, and negative existentials are examples, are both true because they correctly deny existence, and false because they refer to their subjects, and reference presupposes existence. And this paraconsistent approach accepts contradiction, develops logics that allow true contradictions without explosion, without allowing everything to be provable. And while controversial, paraconsistent logic provides one way of handling the paradox, accepts that negative existentials are genuinely paradoxical, are both true and false. The statement stands: Zeus does not exist, unicorns are not real, nothing is something, and the paradox remains, hovering over negative existentials, challenging theories of reference, forcing recognition that denying existence is not as simple as it seems. That we cannot straightforwardly say that something is nothing without creating logical tension, and the paradox of non-being endures as one of the oldest problems in philosophy, a problem recognized by Plato, central to Parmenides, unresolved by centuries of analysis. And various solutions exist, various ways of dissolving or accepting the paradox, but no consensus emerges, and the paradox persists, a reminder that language struggles to express non-existence, that negation creates puzzles, and that the boundary between being and non-being resists clear articulation. The paradox of free will. Why choice seems both real and impossible. A person stands at a crossroads, two paths diverging, and must choose which way to go. And the person deliberates, weighs options, considers consequences, and makes a decision. Chooses one path. And this choosing feels free, feels like the person could have chosen otherwise. Like the decision was truly up to them, genuinely within their control. And yet the person's decision is the result of brain processes, is caused by prior states of neurons, by chemical reactions, by electrical signals, and these processes are themselves caused by earlier states, by genetics and experience and current circumstances, and the chain of causation extends back through the person's life, through evolution, through the physical history of the universe. And at no point in this causal chain is there a break, a moment where cause gives way to free choice, where determinism is suspended. And if every event has causes, if the present is determined by the past plus the laws of physics, then the person's decision was determined long before the moment of choosing, was inevitable given prior conditions. And the feeling of free choice is an illusion. The decision was never really up to the person, could not have been otherwise. And this creates the paradox of free will, the apparent incompatibility between the subjective experience of freedom and the objective reality of causal determination. Between the feeling that we choose and the fact that our choices are caused, and this paradox has troubled philosophers for millennia, generated enormous literature, produced multiple attempted solutions, but never achieved consensus. And the problem persists as one of the central questions in philosophy, ethics, and the nature of human agency. Imagine the person's brain at the moment of decision, neurons firing in specific patterns, dopamine and serotonin modulating activity, and these patterns cause the decision, determine which path is chosen, and the patterns themselves were caused by prior brain states, by sensory inputs, by memories activated, by emotional states, and these prior states had their own causes, and the causal chain is unbroken, and nowhere in this chain is there room for free will, for choices that are not caused, for decisions that could have been different given exactly the same prior conditions. And if determinism is true, if the laws of physics determine everything, then free will seems impossible, seems to be a conceptual confusion, and yet the feeling of freedom persists, and we hold people responsible for their actions, praise and blame them, treat them as if their choices were free, and the legal system, morality, social practices all assume free will, assume that people could have done otherwise. And the paradox is that free will seems both necessary for responsibility and impossible given causation. The paradox generates three main positions: compatibilism, which says free will is compatible with determinism; incompatibilism, which says they are incompatible; and libertarianism. Not political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism, which accepts incompatibility and argues that determinism is false, that humans have genuine free will, and different philosophers defend each position with different arguments, and no consensus emerges, and the debate continues, and the paradox remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, and this might reflect a deep feature of human existence, that we cannot escape the feeling of freedom, even if we become convinced intellectually that freedom is impossible, that the first-person perspective of deliberation requires treating ourselves as free even if the third-person perspective of science shows that we are determined. Visualize determinism as a timeline. The state of the universe at one time, plus the laws of physics, determines the state at the next time. And this determination is complete, includes everything, includes brain states and decisions, and the timeline is like a film that has already been recorded, and we are living through it, experiencing events as they unfold. But the sequence is fixed, was fixed by initial conditions billions of years ago, and our decisions as frames in this film are determined by previous frames. And no alternative timeline is possible given the initial conditions and the laws. And if this picture is correct, then the feeling of having options, of being able to choose differently, is illusory. We could not have chosen differently. The decision was already encoded in the prior state of the universe, and we are not free. Compatibilists respond that this picture misunderstands what free will requires, that free will does not require the ability to have chosen differently given exactly the same prior conditions, does not require breaking the causal chain, but only requires that our choices flow from our own desires, values, character, that we are not coerced, not forced, not manipulated, and as long as the person's decision resulted from their own deliberation, their own reasons, they acted freely, even though their deliberation was caused, even though their reasons were determined. And free will is compatible with determinism because free will is about the source of action, about whether it comes from the agent's own psychology, not about whether it is uncaused. Incompatibilists reject compatibilism, argue that if determinism is true, then everything we do was determined by factors beyond our control. By genetics we did not choose, by environments we did not create, by causal chains that began before we were born. And we are not genuinely responsible for actions that were determined by factors beyond our control. And compatibilist free will is not real freedom, but is a verbal trick, is redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism, and genuine freedom, the kind required for moral responsibility, requires that we could have done otherwise, requires that our choices are not determined. And since determinism is probably true, given physics, genuine free will probably does not exist, and moral responsibility is problematic. Libertarians argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics shows that the universe is not deterministic, that there is genuine randomness, genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and this indeterminacy allows for free will, allows for choices that are not determined by prior states. But critics respond that randomness is not freedom, that random neural processes do not give us control over our actions, do not make us responsible, and adding randomness to determinism does not create free will, creates only determinism plus chance, and neither determination nor chance gives us the control required for responsibility. The paradox of free will also has practical implications for criminal justice, for morality, for how we treat each other, because if free will is an illusion, then punishment seems unjustified, seems cruel, and blame seems inappropriate, and we should respond to harmful behaviour with rehabilitation or prevention rather than retribution. And yet the practice of holding people responsible seems essential to social life, seems unavoidable even if philosophically problematic. And we continue to blame and praise, punish and reward, as if free will exists, and perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps human social life requires treating people as responsible, even if the metaphysical foundations are shaky. The person stands at the crossroads, deliberates, chooses, and walks down one path, and whether this choice was free remains disputed, remains one of philosophy's hardest questions, and the paradox endures. Free will seems both essential and impossible, both real and illusory, and the tension between these perspectives remains unresolved, and perhaps the tension is permanent, is a feature of human existence that cannot be eliminated, that we must live with the subjective feeling of freedom while recognizing the objective reality of causation, and the paradox of free will persists as a permanent puzzle about human agency, about responsibility, about whether we are authors of our actions or merely characters in a predetermined story. And the question remains open, continues to generate debate, continues to matter for ethics and law and self-understanding. And the crossroads remains, the paths diverge, the choice is made, and whether it was truly free remains one of philosophy's deepest and most enduring questions. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside. And this suggests that omniscience, defined as knowing everything, is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything. And these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other: propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red, but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing, and so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant. But omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant, and the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience, and so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes. And this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things. And the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability. And so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection, and this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better. But perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient, but this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible, and so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, and this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox, a paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all? And the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained. Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking. And the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained. That the question why something, rather than nothing, has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything, and so there can be no explanation for the totality, and so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts, and if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, and we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation, and if existence requires no explanation, then the question why something rather than nothing has no answer is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all, and from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being, and the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. An absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something, and so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are. Existence is actual. Something exists, and this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason. And this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. And various arguments have been offered for necessary existence, arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. and these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations. And each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy, and the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer, and we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life, and the question echoes, why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground, and the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble, a paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation. And the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal, to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralysed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes. Suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts a decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good, and this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other. And the relationship is not linear, but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. and at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of fiction: why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief. And yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim. argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception, a mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist, and the tears are real even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of confirmation. Why seeing a red apple proves all ravens are black. A scientist seeks to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and the obvious way to test this hypothesis is to observe ravens, to find ravens and check their colour. And each black raven found provides evidence for the hypothesis, confirms it slightly, makes it more likely to be true. And this seems straightforward, seems like basic scientific method. Observe instances that match the hypothesis and they provide confirmation. But philosopher Carl Hempel noticed something strange, something that reveals how confirmation works in unexpected ways. And the strangeness begins with a logical equivalence. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to the statement, all non-black things are non-ravens. These two statements have exactly the same truth conditions. If one is true, then the other must be true. If one is false, then the other must be false. And so anything that confirms one statement should confirm the other, should provide equal evidence for both. But now consider what confirms the statement. All non-black things are non-ravens, and observing a non-black non-raven should confirm it. Observing a red apple provides evidence that all non-black things are non-ravens because a red apple is non-black and is a non-raven. And since all non-black things are non-ravens is equivalent to all ravens are black, observing a red apple should confirm that all ravens are black. And this seems absurd, seems like observing apples in your kitchen has nothing to do with the colour of ravens. And yet the logic is impeccable, and this is the paradox of confirmation, also called Hempel's paradox or the Raven paradox. A puzzle about how evidence works, about what confirms scientific hypotheses, and about whether our intuitions about confirmation can be trusted. Imagine a scientist sitting in a laboratory surrounded by red apples, carefully noting each one, recording that it is red and not a raven, and claiming that this investigation provides evidence about ravens, evidence that all ravens are black. And this seems ridiculous. Seems like the scientist has confused what is relevant to the hypothesis, has mistaken irrelevant observations for genuine evidence, and yet the logical structure is clear. Each red apple confirms that all non-black things are non-ravens, and this statement is logically equivalent to all ravens are black. And confirmation should be closed under logical equivalence. If observation O confirms hypothesis H, and H is equivalent to H, then O should confirm H out, otherwise confirmation would depend on how we phrase hypotheses rather than on what they say. And so the scientist with the red apples is doing legitimate science, is confirming a hypothesis about ravens even though no ravens are involved. And the paradox forces us to either accept this counterintuitive conclusion or reject some principle we thought was obvious about how confirmation works. The paradox reveals tension between formal logic and intuitive judgment. Because formally the argument is valid, red apples do confirm that all ravens are black through the equivalence with all non-black things are non-ravens, but intuitively this seems wrong. seems like red apples are irrelevant to ravens, and resolving this tension requires either explaining why the formal conclusion is actually correct and our intuitions are misleading, or showing where the formal argument goes wrong, where a principle we thought was valid actually fails. And both options have been pursued, have generated extensive philosophical literature, have produced multiple proposed solutions, none of which has won universal acceptance. Visualize the logical space of all objects, divided into 4 categories: black ravens, which confirm the hypothesis directly; non-black ravens, which would falsify the hypothesis; black non-ravens like coal or blackboards, which seem irrelevant; and non-black non-ravens like red apples, which also seem irrelevant. And the paradox says that observing objects in the 4th category, non-black non-ravens, provides evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black, because these observations confirm the equivalent hypothesis that all non-black things are non-ravens, and each red apple, each green leaf, each blue car provides a tiny bit of evidence that ravens are black. And while this sounds absurd, it follows from principles of confirmation that seem undeniable. One proposed solution appeals to background knowledge and prior probabilities, argues that red apples do confirm that all ravens are black, but the confirmation is so tiny as to be practically negligible, because we have vast background knowledge about the number of non-black things in the universe. We know there are billions and billions of non-black objects, and observing one red apple increases our confidence that all non-black things are non-ravens by an infinitesimal amount, whereas we have much less background knowledge about ravens, and observing one black raven increases our confidence that all ravens are black by a larger amount. And so both observations provide confirmation, but in vastly different degrees. And this explains why it seems pointless to observe red apples when investigating raven colour. Not because they provide no confirmation, but because they provide so little confirmation that the exercise is worthless. And this Bayesian solution preserves the formal logic while explaining the intuition, accepts that red apples confirm the hypothesis, but explains why we correctly ignore them. Another solution challenges the equivalence condition, argues that confirmation is not closed under logical equivalence, that logically equivalent statements can receive different confirmation from the same observation. And the reason is that confirmation depends not just on logical form, but on the way hypotheses are stated, on which predicates are used, on how the hypothesis carves up the world. And all ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, while logically equivalent organise the world differently, make different predicates primary, and observations confirm hypotheses relative to these organisations. And a black raven confirms the first hypothesis more than the second, and a red apple confirms the second more than the first, even though they are equivalent. And this solution rejects the principle that equivalent hypotheses must receive equal confirmation from the same observation. A third solution appeals to selective confirmation, argues that observing a red apple provides some evidence for all ravens are black, but only under certain conditions, only when the observation is made in a context where it has the potential to falsify the hypothesis. And seeing a red apple in your kitchen where you never expected to find a raven provides no confirmation, provides no new information. But seeing a red apple in a context where you might have found a non-black raven, where the observation had the potential to reveal a counterexample, does provide confirmation. And so confirmation depends not just on what is observed, but on the circumstances of observation, on what was at stake, on what alternatives were possible. And this solution ties confirmation to potential falsification, treats confirmation as depending on whether observations eliminate possibilities rather than merely matching hypotheses. The paradox also connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's problem of how we can justify inferring from observed instances to unobserved cases, because confirming all ravens are black by observing black ravens assumes that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved ravens will be like observed ravens, and this assumption itself cannot be justified without circularity. And the paradox adds another layer, shows that even if we accept induction, we face puzzles about what counts as confirming evidence, about whether observations of non-ravens can tell us about ravens, and these puzzles reveal that confirmation is more complex than it appears, cannot be reduced to simple pattern matching or accumulation of positive instances. The scientist with the red apples continues recording, carefully noting each observation, and the paradox hangs over the investigation, a question about whether this absurd procedure is actually legitimate science, whether red apples really do provide evidence about ravens, and the answer depends on how we understand confirmation, on which principles we accept, on whether we follow formal logic or intuitive judgment, and the paradox remains unresolved in the sense that different solutions appeal to different intuitions, make different trade-offs, and no consensus has emerged, only a recognition that confirmation is subtle, that evidence works in non-obvious ways, that formal principles can lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the relationship between observation and theory, between data and hypothesis, between evidence and confirmation, is more complex than common sense suggests, and Hempel's paradox endures as a classic problem in philosophy of science, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of scientific method, a reminder that even basic concepts like confirmation and evidence conceal difficulties that philosophy has not fully resolved. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others, and then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective taking, increases confidence, increases risk taking, and these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Daché Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power, and powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues. And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, and without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course, power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want. Feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy and perspective taking. And research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power, and leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective-taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant, remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it.